Hello and welcome. It is episode number 39 of the Hilarious Humanitarians Podcast. I am Frances Echeverria, licensed marriage and family therapist. Deanna Silverman out this week, but I do have a special guest who's going to be joining me to talk all about grief today. We'll get to know her in just a second. Before we jump in, want to direct you to our Instagram accounts if you have not found them. I am Shut Up Skippy, Deanna, Hilarious Humanitarian, and you can also find the H Humanitarians Podcast for our specific Instagram accounts, also available at shutupskippy.com and hilarioushumanitarian.com. Today we're going to be talking to Vanessa Fierstadt, a fellow LMFT who dedicates her work to grief and loss in the greater Los Angeles area. We're going to share some personal stories related to grief and loss, some really important educational information that we all should have been taught a long time ago, whether you're talking about the loss of a loved one, the loss of a child, a spouse, some sort of great loss in relationships. We'll cover that. And we're also going to check in on self-care and pushing our comfort zone in an effort to build resiliency, which we challenge you to do every week at your home. Before we start, want to make sure that you are subscribed and rating our podcast, please. That helps us out. And a brief disclaimer that the Hilarious Humanitarians Podcast is for informational purposes only, does not constitute medical advice, and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please always seek the advice of your physician, mental health professional, or other qualified health provider with any questions you have regarding a medical condition. So as we get started, I want to introduce you to Vanessa. Hello.
Hi.
Isn't technology great that we could do this podcast from hundreds of miles away?
It's pretty amazing.
So you are right now finally home from a long day of working in what part of LA? I'm sorry, past the Grapevine in Central California. Yeah. It's all LA.
You're right. Well, we met in Fresno. So like that, once you get past the Grapevine, it's like, what is there? Yeah. So I'm in Pasadena, California, and also serve Glendale, Monrovia, Altadena. So all these little pockets around what we call the San Gabriel Valley. And then also I see clients as well from the Los Angeles area, whether it's doing telehealth because traffic here in LA is
miserable.
A bit nuts. But yeah, that's where my home is, Pasadena right now.
Okay, so as you mentioned, you and I got to know each other in grad school, both Fresno State graduates, go Bulldogs. And I met you at a time in your life before grief came just barreling through it. We were young, naive, green, wannabe therapists. And I only found out after the fact, after we graduated, some of the significant things that you had to deal with and how you've turned this into a really successful and also just filling a need for those in your community and related to grief and loss. And before I even, I guess, get into that, maybe we should talk about what we're talking about with grief and loss.
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's a big topic, I think, especially like in today's world of like people throw this word around every day. And it's like, what does that mean? You know, so I think you and I discussed earlier, like, where do we even start with this, right? Because it is so vast and it is so big.
So when you've heard the 5 stages of grief, everybody.
We've all heard it. In grad school, we call it DAPDA, right? Which is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and anger.
Or acceptance.
Acceptance, yes.
Yeah. There's a lot of anger in there too. But yeah,
there's a lot of anger in there too, yeah.
At the end of this little cycle, because that's what we like to do, is make everything look like a little itty bitty package that you can wrap up with a bow. You've come to acceptance.
Right. And even in our training and our program specifically, you know, grief was, I think, maybe a couple hours of our training. If that. And I think it doesn't really prepare us in terms of what we are getting into in real life and what we're going to get into with our clients. So I really learned that, I think, the hard way, not only as a person and a human being, but also as a clinician as well, and what that entailed in actually doing grief work.
So can we just jump into why you picked grief work?
So grief was not something I would have raised my hand and been like, yes, I want to do this.
I'm going to walk through the most painful parts of people's life.
She is ripping off the Band-Aid, you guys. So we're just going to go for it. Yeah, I think a lot of people shy away from grief. I mean, who wants to talk about death and dying and sadness and depression? Nobody, you know, but I went through a really difficult time in my life. And I guess we just go with it. You know, I met the love of my life in 2006. Oh man, we'll talk about my age. I think I was 23 at the time. And as we talk about grief, we'll talk about how blurry things get, because some of my memory actually from that time is very scattered. But I met the love of my life back in 2006. And when I met him, he was in remission from cancer, a very rare form of cancer called Ewing sarcoma, which is predominantly a pediatric cancer that is found in young children. He had not found out about this cancer until he was about 21. So he was diagnosed at 21 and basically found out that they were going to be doing the most experimental treatment on him as an adult that they had ever done, and basically said, we're pretty much going to kill you and bring you back to life if we can. Ugh. So he had gone through this part of his life, because I met him later on when he was 20, 25, 26. So he'd already been through this kind of rough treatment. So the story goes, I'm walking into my parents' house, summer break from, college, and my brother's throwing a party because my parents are out of town.
Oh.
And yeah, fun times. And here, when you just have those moments where you walk into a room and there is a presence and
right, you feel it.
And it is just, I don't know what this is, but I have to take it. I have to go explore this thing. So here was this, of course, musician, speaks to me, strumming his guitar and singing in the middle of my living room that I grew up in as a child. And I said to my brother, I don't know who that is, but you need to figure out a way to introduce us. So later on, I found out that he had seen me walking, a different part of the night, and said to my brother, who's that girl? And he said, I didn't even know you had a sister. And so, the story kind of speaks for itself. We connected immediately. We were inseparable. He was and has been the light of my life ever since. We went through a lot of friendship together and a lot of struggles together. And the funny thing is, when I met him, he was bald because he had been in remission before I met him. And so he joked about how he couldn't imagine that someone could, find him attractive with a bald head. And I just thought he was like the hottest thing in the world. And so, we had a lot of fun together, and he was in remission for quite some time. And then he slowly started to have the Ewings come back. And he was a very active human being. He was what I call the Superman of cancer. They told him he would never be able to walk again after they had found the Ewings in his pancreas the first time. And he got back on his snowboard and after remission and went into the oncology and said, I know you're probably going to kick me out of the oncology department after I show you this, but, he was a life liver, like to his
right.
So, it's hard to even, as I talk about it now, like think about how the steps, but he had been in and out of remission after we met, and it came back in his neck. Then it came back in his eyebrow bone, which we didn't even know existed.
That even happens, right?
Yeah. And because Ewing's is predominantly a bone cancer, once it goes into soft tissue, that's a very scary thing. And so he had felt a couple bumps on his ribs, and we ended up going to the oncology department, and indeed the Ewings had come back, and we had, I think he removed 3 to 4 of his ribs. And he was doing, for him, well. He was responding to treatment. He was moving slowly, but he was happy to be alive. And a couple months went by after remission or treatment, and we found out that the cancer had spread from his ribs into his lungs, which is now soft tissue. And it was the first time. Greg was never a person to ask the oncologist about time. He did not believe in that. He believed that there was no answer to that question, and that if you were given a timeline, that would, kind of shadow the rest of your treatment. So I knew that something was serious when we were sitting on the hospital bed together, and he said to the doctor, how much time is there? And I remember seeing the look on her face, because she had treated him for years, right? She's known him since he was 21,
Right.
And she said, you have about 6 months. And I'll never forget that moment, because I was sitting in the room with him, his mom and I, and they said, we want to give you some time to talk about what you want to do. And so they left the room. And in between that time, we talked. Of course, how do you at any stage cope with the thought that the love of your life and you have 6 months left to live? What do you do with that news? And when the doctors and the nurses came back in, they said, do you want to go on a trip? Do you want to go home? Do you want to, whatever it is, we will make it happen. Mm-hmm. And he grabbed my hand and he looked at me and he said, I want to marry the love of my life.
In the hospital room?
Yeah.
Oh.
So make that happen. And I'm tearing up now too, because I don't even recognize sometimes like how profound it is that this man knew what was in store for him. And all he wanted to do was to be present, ever present in like our love. And we have photos of us. We made engagement rings out of tissues that we had been like sopping in. And I still have them, because to me, I look back on it too now, things after you experience things like this, how special is that? We didn't need jewelry. We didn't need a videographer. We didn't need all these things. It was just, I love you. And that is it. That's all that I have to give to you, So we planned our wedding in 3 days.
Oh my gosh.
In 3 days. And he couldn't leave the hospital at this point because he had just been put on oxygen. We had someone come in to fit him for a tux. We had someone come in to fit him for a wedding ring. I found a wedding dress, 2 days before our wedding, and it was perfect fit. I mean, as much tragedy there was, we were also the luckiest people in the world at that time. And there was, we were working with City of Hope, who are amazing, and they had an amazing staff who had a really special kind of family that had come into our lives who said that they wanted to be a part of this, and they kind of really planned our entire wedding for us. So we got married on September 30th on a Sunday afternoon at the beach, and he was so happy. These photos that I see of him now, I'm like, wow, even though I look back and he's sick, I've never seen him smile so big. He was surrounded by all of our family and our friends. And it's really crazy to think now that we had the gift to be able to do that together. He woke up the next morning really struggling to breathe. And we were planning on going on a honeymoon, which we knew was going to be very local. We were going to go to Malibu or something like that. But we weren't, sure how that would go. And we ended up going straight to the hospital. We almost had to get airlifted to the hospital.
This is the day after?
This is the day after our wedding. Yeah. So he ultimately ended up dying 2 days after we got married. I say he died the day after we got married because it all blended in together.
Right.
But it was technically 2 days. And I went from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows without even blinking, through these questions of, we had 6 months. It's been literally 5 to 6 days. Right. How did this happen so fast? It's a tough thing to be an oncologist. I recognize now there is no crystal ball. There is no, there is nothing.
No way of knowing.
There's no way of knowing. It was interesting too as a therapist because I remember sitting in the bathroom. I mean, this is really, you guys, like the raw and the gritty of life, right? I remember sitting in our hotel bathroom the morning after our wedding. I just been given a job offer.
Oh God.
A therapy job offer. And I was supposed to start the next Monday. And he's sitting in the bathroom, throwing up. And I'm rubbing his back and I'm trying to figure out what I even do. And he's saying to me, take the job. We're going to be okay. You know, to his core, he was an optimist. To his core, he was a life liver, you know. And, you know, the ultimate thing is I went to that job maybe for like 2 days and then I left, you know, because there was no way I could be a functioning human being at that point in time. So that's where it all started. You know, this was the beginning of my career. This was the baby steps of therapist for me. And ultimately what happened was I was a young widow. I didn't know where I fit. I tried myself to find a grief therapist, a grief group. Most of the groups that I was referred to were people 65 and over who had lost a spouse from illness of old age.
Right. And you're what, 20 something?
Yes, and I'm 20 something. And it was actually really detrimental because I would go to those groups and the response would be, you're so lucky. You have so much time left to find someone else. And my response was, it's actually the opposite. I have the rest of my life to live without him, you know? And so for me, it was really, and I did end up finding a really great grief group who I now call my floaty device. You know, these people, these people have really become amazing, great friends of mine in my life. But it's hard as a young person. And I think we'll talk too about society and grief and all those things, but to find where you fit. You know, I also was told that, you know, I could go, there was a group, but it was only for wives of veterans. And because he wasn't a veteran, I couldn't be a part of the group. So it felt very like disenfranchised too, you know, in terms of like, where did I fit? So that's where my journey started and really where I created like, let's create something that doesn't exist. You know, and that's where my work kind of began. And I started to do grief training and run grief groups here in Pasadena and do individual grief work and work with, again, because cancer has a very, you know, special place in my heart and in my life. I work with a lot with cancer related illnesses and families. So, you know, that is the long-winded answer.
God. And that's the first time I want to point out, I was trying to keep my shit together on this end because I'm thinking she's telling this story and I do not need her to like get into therapist mode and make me feel better. But that, I mean, I've known you for several years, and I've known the overarching story, but I didn't know the details and how you are such a nice and positive and sweet and put together person. Like that would just crush anybody and rightfully so almost, you know, you could take that path where you just turn into someone who's angry or just detached, you know, doesn't believe in love, doesn't believe in.
Yeah. Anything. And don't get me wrong. Like I had, you know, this is a journey, right? Grief is a journey, you guys. And I went through a lot of darkness. You know, this was not I'm a therapist, you know, I'm resilient, I'm going to be okay. No, like I had to take time off from being a therapist for a while because your world cracks open, right? You see things differently. I tell people now, the rose-colored glasses come off indefinitely. Yeah. You know, our threshold for bullshit, pardon the French, becomes minimal, you know.
Which is almost like a gift you don't realize until after the fact, you know?
Yeah, exactly. There's that quote, you know, everything has cracks and that's how the light gets in. At the beginning of my grief, of course, I was like, I don't want to hear that stuff. There is a lot of truth to that.
So it was messy. It didn't go through the stages that we were talking about.
Yeah, and that's really important. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is like the godmother, if you will, of death and dying studies for us as therapists, you know, the thing they don't really tell us is that none of it goes in order, you know, and anytime I'm working with a client or I'm starting a grief group, I give them this paper and this paper has just stuff all over it. It's messy. There's words, there's denial, there's what if, there's anger, there's lack of sleep, there's I'm not eating and appetite and isolation and not being touched, all these things. And I ask people, does this look messy to you? And of course they go, yeah. And I go, do you know why? And 9 out of 10 times my clients go, yeah, because I feel all of it. And it's never one singular thing, you know? And so I think what's important about being able to talk about our grief openly is that we get to know that we're not crazy. I hear so much from people that I feel like I'm going crazy after a loved one has died or after, a child has died.
Or even the loss of a significant relationship because...
Yes, and we'll talk about, that too, because you can grieve those things, right? And what that feels like inside your body. And so many people don't have the opportunity to talk about those, with someone. So I think when they do, most of the times I hear like, oh my gosh, it's such a relief that you're telling me that I'm not crazy.
I think that leads into a question I wanted to ask is, so all the training as a therapist that I've had and the hours I've spent being a therapist, sometimes even in my personal relationship, there is no right thing to say. I know what the wrong thing was to say in that situation where those older people in the grief group were telling you had more time. That was the worst thing to say. But I don't know if I don't know. My thing lately has just been, there is no right thing to say right here, but I'm here to listen because people don't want to hear the icky. They don't want to hear your hurt story.
Right.
Per se,
Yes. And I think there's something really important about that, especially now we've had a lot of suicide talk going around because of, suicide. But the important thing is we've been having suicide forever, right? And the moment we have celebrities who are going through this, then we open up and talk about it,
And then it shuts down again.
Right.
Until the next one.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I think grief group is so important because people are not afraid to talk about the icky and the messy and the details and shy away from that. And I think to answer your question, listen, be there. You don't have to fix it. There is nothing to fix. Some of the best and most memorable moments for people in my life, they would show up at my door. They would drop off a cup of soup and they would tell me that they loved me. And sometimes they wouldn't even come in. And sometimes they would come in and they would just sit with me while I cried. And that was perfect for me because I didn't have anything to say.
You just had to feel the feelings.
Right.
I think that applies not just to the loss of a loved one, whether it's a young husband or a parent, but just in terms of loss in general. I think sometimes we tend to shy away from it. Or I know I've gotten uncomfortable when I've heard people talking about a loss. I mean, the situation I'm thinking about is someone that I know that lost an infant at like a month, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, this is inappropriate. Why are you talking about this here? What are you doing? This is uncomfortable. It was uncomfortable for me.
Right.
And so, I mean, I know it was all over my body language. It was all over my attempts to get the hell out of there.
Right.
And I don't have the answer, but I guess what we could do in this podcast as clinicians and as people is to help direct people in the right way, like how to respond or to at least allow the conversation to happen, not shut it down if it needs to happen.
Yeah. And I think that really speaks to us as a society. And
we don't talk about death.
Right. We don't talk about death. So of course, when you hear about death, and of course you guys we don't want to talk about it, right? It's awful. But at the same time, this is the one thing that we are all going to experience. We might not experience it as early, but we have babies, we have children who are losing their parents, whether it's an accident or whether it's suicide, right? Most of the time we live in a state of denial where we go, oh, like maybe I'll lose a grandparent when they're 80.
Right.
Right. But I feel like that's so detrimental to us, not only as humans, but as clinicians too, because that's really not the truth. And so I feel like we need to start talking about what the reality of those things are. And we might feel more comfortable, like you said, in that moment, talking to that woman or that friend of how can I just sit here and listen without having that reaction of I have to go,
Right. Just run.
And I think you're right. Being able to just sit and listen. And I also think to validate, and to go, this sounds really painful, and that really goes back to the basics of like 101, right? Of our work, which is, it seems so simple, but it's so important.
I know it's so important. And I know too that as someone in grief, I have monitored myself so that people don't feel like they need to jump in and save me. I've also been monitored myself so that they wouldn't make judgments. And so, for instance, I'm thinking, I'm sitting here recording in my kitchen and I'm looking across at my fridge, and on my fridge is we're so weird sometimes. You know, the pamphlet you hand out at a funeral?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's my mom. Okay.
Yeah.
And I've talked about my mom on here before. My mom's death was a long, drawn out one, and one that I couldn't explain to people when she finally died, because she was sick and she did not take care of herself. There was a lot that went into that. And there were so many near deaths that it was like a roller coaster. When she died, don't get me wrong, I miss her. I miss the healthier her that was like there. When she died, I was so relieved. And if I would have dared say that to anybody, I know I would have gotten so much shit. Not because I wanted her gone already and she was a pain, but because once she was gone, I could stop being angry at her and I could just grieve her. I could just be sad. You know, I can look back now and like miss her, or wish, you know, like think she would like this, or I see myself as a mom and think of the little things that she did, but I can honestly look back without the anger. And it wasn't until she died that I could actually let go of that, because it was so complicated. But the reason why I bring it up is, I mean, I couldn't say that to my dad. I couldn't say that to my sister. I think maybe I said it to one person. You know, like, how do you say, God, I'm glad they're gone? Right. I mean, like, I'm not glad she's dead, but like, I'm glad that's over. Does that make sense? Even right now, there's probably someone going,
right.
But
this is why. Yeah. And this is part of going back to that paper that I told you I give my groups, is that we do feel relief. That is one of the words that is on that paper. And sometimes we feel guilt along with that relief, you know, but some of us are going through being a caregiver. Some of us are going through, you know, these experiences, watching our loved one continually going through medical treatments, going through the pain, going through the process. And that takes a toll on us too.
And addiction too, because I've dealt with this with people that are wrapped up with, you know, family members that are stuck in addiction. Like, is this going to be the time that I get the phone call and it's an overdose?
Yeah. And it's kind of that anticipatory grief, right? Where we're anticipating that to come. And that's also really difficult too.
What you created then were these grief groups in the Pasadena area where people could come and talk about these complicated things, right?
Yes.
Were there criteria, certain people in certain groups, certain losses?
Yeah, I try to, as much as I can, like to run my groups by the type of loss.
Okay.
Because I feel like there is a camaraderie around the loss of a parent, the loss of a child, the loss of a spouse. There have been scenarios too where we don't have enough, and so we do a mixed group, and those groups ends up being really beautiful and heartwarming as well. And the work is just as powerful, right? But I do, if I can, try and do them by the loss, the type of loss.
And it's not something where, this is where I want to preface this statement. I doubt that it's anybody listening to us, but maybe you hear this out. When their initial reaction is, well, I don't want to hear people like wallow and woe is me. Because there is that reaction. I think sometimes I get that a lot when I try and tell people to go to recovery groups. Like, I don't want to hear a bunch of people complain. If you can't express compassion for other people and their loss and their struggle, then my guess as a clinician is you can't express compassion and understanding for yourself during a struggle. So my guess is that in these groups, it is a processing of feelings. It is not a woe is me, come save me, I need the spotlight type.
Correct. Most people, and I tell people this too because this is important, I do not throw people into groups right away. I talk to people about when they first call me, how long has it been? How are you doing? Are you eating? Are you sleeping? Are you going to work? What is your level of functioning?
Because that's a very basic thing that people just forget to do. Like you said, you don't even know timelines.
Right. And it's a really common thing. And so I always tell people that I recommend them coming into individual therapy to tell and share their story to one person first. Right. Until they feel ready to be able to, because when you're in a group, you have to also listen to other people's loss. And while that might feel bonding at a certain point in time, it can also feel very overwhelming. Right. So you have to be at a place in your grief and in your level of functioning where that's going to actually be a productive thing and not
shut you down.
Yeah, not shut you down. So it just depends. Each person's different. Something I want to mention too is the grief police, which I think can be people. It can be work. It can be, loved ones around us. Again, going back to societal things, this is not something that we can contain, nor should we contain. If there's people out there listening, and I hope sharing my story too. I think there's something about us as therapists being kind of like, we're in our offices and we take on everyone else's stuff, but we're okay and we're strong all the time. And I hope hearing my story also helps other people understand that we are human too, and that you are allowed to share and open up as well. And so I was just wanting to note on that in terms of work and bereavement time. You and I briefly chatted about this, that what does it say about us as a society that, you guys, the statistics are that bereavement leave tends to typically be 3 days. And as I was looking it up earlier, it says if they're generous, it's 5, right? And so I just want you to think about, if you loved someone for your entire life, and then you're told, and just to think about that for a second, you have 3 days to grieve, basically. Mm-hmm. That's what we're told. Just what message that sends to us, in terms of what we are allowed to do or give ourselves permission to do. I hear people who come into my office a lot say, well, yeah, like they only gave me 3 days off of work. How am I supposed to go in?
Yeah.
And how people around the office treat me because they know my mom has, died. And we work through that, and being able to talk to your uppers, talk to your bosses, talk to them about, the time that you might need, and how to talk to coworkers about that also. So you don't feel isolated. So you don't feel like this outlier that is going to make your grief worse. Does that make sense?
Right. I had a situation when my mom died. I was working at a recovery center, and they allowed me 1 day. Now, I was in a different place in terms of losing my mom because, like I said, it was almost like a relief, but I did kind of need to go to her funeral,
Of course.
Kind of needed to go.
Kind of, just a little, just to show.
I was told, and I know that this made my boss at the time very uncomfortable because she and I had been friends before we worked together, and she ended up taking care of it. But I had been told that I needed to provide a copy of the funeral program for documentation.
Right.
And that's pretty standard practice, so I'm not throwing them under the bus. But can I just say fuck you to every person who has ever used a death to get out of going to work? Here's a thought. Don't do it, because it's that makes people who have real deaths have to get copies of their mom's death program so they can get a day off of work. I just this is going to be on my soapbox. I feel like if you use how many times are you going to kill off your dead grandmother?
Yeah.
And it's just completely disrespectful. And then you find these companies that aren't trying to be jerks, but they have to because they have to, it just makes it inhumane.
Right. And that just goes back to think about why, I understand people might, but why don't we live in a world where it's, I'm going to take your damn word for it. How many people really take that and use it as a manipulative tactic, that we've had to have this in place.
Right.
And so I'm a big believer and trying to be an advocate for changing some of these things that are in place in terms of, the 3 day, 5 day. Look, you got one. Why is that there? How do we change that? How do we give people more time?
Right. And just being understanding of the fact that it is a complicated process. Now we're talking about loss in terms of a death, but grief and loss in does exist on different levels. We talked about, maybe it's a significant relationship, maybe it's divorce, maybe it's, an area where I know I have a real hard time. I don't even know how to answer is if somebody miscarries. My mom's story before she had me, she was 7.5 months pregnant, had already gone on maternity leave, thought something was up, called the doctor. The doctor said, wait, you have an appointment on Monday or whatever. She comes in Monday, finds out that not only did she lose the baby during that time at 7.5 months, she was pregnant with twins and had to deliver them.
Wow.
And so I know that affected her later. But we never really talked about, like, I knew I lost sister, but she never talked to it about us. And then so, I've also had other family members and people who have had miscarriages and you don't know what to say.
Sure.
Or people even, we're not going to get onto the abortion topic, but there is loss that is wrapped up in those choices, and talk about grief that you're not allowed to express.
Absolutely.
So,
right. Because, all of those things, and as you're saying, like, even because I want you to think about this, grief is multifaceted, right? It's physical, it's behavioral, it's cognitive, right? And we think about holding all of that in and not being able to share it. I mean, I think that's the crazy making part, right? That we are, that if we do that, how are we supposed to function in general? And you're talking about, the loss of a child and the loss of, having miscarriages. And we have to be mindful too, that those moms and those dads and those family members, they're grieving not only the physicality of what happened, but also what their babies would have looked like and what their lives would have been. And I'm going to tell you something right now. Dates are so important, for those of us who have experienced loss, and you can probably speak to this too. Like, we know the date of the death of their anniversary. I can feel in my bones when October is coming. It's the weirdest thing, and
your body remembers without you even looking at a calendar. And I tell clients that.
Yeah. And I have
when the change of the weather.
Yeah. Yeah. Just talking about that. Like when fall comes, when October comes, I know it's that time, and so those things to us are really precious. And I talk to people about, celebrating their life, not celebrating their death.
You just did that for Greg's birthday, right?
Yeah. So his birthday was July 11th, and I always do something every year. And I never know. I tell people you can't predict how you're going to feel, but have a plan just in case. Okay. And this one was hard for me. And this is my 6th year. And it was I was just, present in myself all day, but really thinking about what he would be doing, what we would be doing, what crazy thing he would be getting into for his birthday, and I spent the day with his mom, which was unexpected but lovely because her and I are very close. And there was something about going through this with her as well that has been a really important and cathartic part of my grief, that there's a part of him out there in the world, and that we get to share all of those really nitty gritty things that we talked about, like with each other. And I don't get to do that with anybody else on the planet. She was in the room with us most of the time, So his birthday. Yeah. So I talk about, being able to give yourself time to do the things that feel good again, to thaw out from being that frozen grief, into thawing out and doing things that you can feel like you can actually move again, you can breathe again, you can start to enjoy life. There is this real thing called survivor's guilt, which I struggled with for some time after he died, which was really an interesting cognitive kind of perception also, which was, why should I be allowed to be here? Why should I be allowed to, and it was small things. It was weird things. This sounds strange, but I'm going to say it anyway. I remember, why should I be able to, shave my legs? That sounds so weird, but it's true. Yeah. I was like, why should I be able to take care of myself in the most minor ways? And this was another thing I call this fragments too. I don't know if you experience this, but it comes in fragments, these things. And sometimes they come in waves, but I'll just get like a memory, or I'll get a glimpse, or I'll get something. I'm like, whoa, where'd that come from? Do you experience that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the thing I think that we've shared on the podcast before, and I'll go back and find it, is it grief when it comes on is like a hurricane in the middle of the ocean. It's just pounding you nonstop. But then over life, like you'll get these waves, or you'll get, like a shake, or, just it. And we can't defend ourselves against them. We just have to kind of let them wash over us. And maybe we have to like hold our breath, or, swim for a minute, or protect your head, from danger zones, whatever. But you can come back up. It's when we actively numb and block that the damage, I think, is done, because it's going to find its way in.
Right. Yeah. I tell people all the time that, grief does us. We don't do grief.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
And I think there's a big part of that. Like you said, too, there's this quote of, grief is like waves, and we don't know when the waves will be calm, and we don't know when the waves will be at their highest. But if we know how to surf, if we know how to float, then when the waves come, no matter how big or how small they are, we're going to be okay. And I think we have to find what that means for us. How do we surf? How do we have a boogie board? How do we have those floaties, like I mentioned, that my group gave me?
I think one of the things to keep in mind, and you had brought this up when sometimes you take phone calls and intakes, is that when you're dealing with grief and loss, and I want to throw this out there too, because we're talking about relationships, we're talking about pregnancies, family members, all that stuff. Grief can also come in, having worked in radio for so long, I have seen people really struggle. I worry about the day that I don't work in radio anymore, because so much of my ego is wrapped up in that. So if you have a job that you really identify with, and then that's ripped out from under you. I've worked with clients, who were teachers or something. And even if it's not ripped out from under you, retirement, there's grief that goes into, everybody thinks retirement's going to be great, but there's grief that goes in with like that part of your life. I've also seen it working in the LGBT community from some of the most loving parents, where the grief is for the dream they thought they had, where they thought their child's life was going to go this way, and they love them either way. But the grief is like, oh, well, but I pictured my daughter walking down the aisle with a man, or those are just some examples, but grief can be wrapped up in some of the strangest types of ways.
Yes. And I have some of those too. I think, to kind of piggyback off of that, another one is like the onset of chronic illness, even if you're young or if you're old, right? The grief of what I thought my life would be, what I thought my life could be, right? I also think surviving an act of like natural disaster, right? Those types of things, going through hurricanes, going through, we just had a huge fire season out here in Los Angeles. We lost a lot of homes and a lot of people, and grieving those types of experiences. I think that's something to talk about too. And you talk about work and retirement, and I think reliable income for people also when they lose those types of things. So that's something to note also. And like you said, relationships doesn't have to be. I get people call me all the time asking me if they would work with me if they're going through a divorce, and they're in the grief of losing, a love of 20 years, even though that person hasn't died, but they're still grieving, and the word bereavement comes from an Old English word, and it means I am deprived of, or I am deprived of something, or deprived of you. And I think that really resonates with me, because it's kind of like this, I have had this thing and I no longer have it. And I think there's that tangibleness about grief. What do we do with not having that tangible? We can't hug you. We can't kiss you. We can't, we can't go to work every day, right? I mean, those are the tangible things, right, that I think we struggle with most too.
This is such a big topic. I think we should definitely, Vanessa, if you're open to it, do more on it, and we can take feedback too if people have specific stuff. But I think the important thing, and what I love about this podcast, is just bringing it to light. Like, we need to just be uncomfortable with talking about the uncomfortable, and grief and loss is something that we all struggle with. there are ways to talk about it and be supportive and not shut down the conversation before it even starts. Because I think sometimes we do that. And like I said, I'm guilty of it. And I also want to point this out. We're talking about this from an adult perspective.
Yeah. We have not even touched child perspective.
And we need to, I want to bring some levity to this. So my oldest has a crush, right? She has her first crush. She's 10. And he of course likes someone else. So she's like having her first little heartbreak. And it could be really easy as a parent who, by the way, I've been divorced twice. So there's some grief. Even if it was the best decisions in the world to get divorced, no one gets married thinking they're going to get divorced. But anyway, our thing is we listen to angsty music. She has picked out a few songs on iTunes. We listen to them loudly. We sing them. And it's all about processing these angsty feelings. And so we need to be aware that everybody experiences grief, even little ones. And it might not be like that big of a deal to us. Like, okay, she's 10, big deal. But it feels real.
Yeah. And I think that you bring up a really important point. And we could do a whole different podcast on children, because how children grieve and how adults grieve are entirely different. And how we as adults talk to children about death and dying is a really big thing. So we can do that. I'm just going to say one thing about that. Using real life terms is super important with kiddos about death and dying. We don't want to scare them, but we also want them to know what has happened. And we need to stop using the term loss. I think with children, this has been talked about a lot in our therapeutic community, because children, what does loss mean? It's like, I lost something. Usually when I lose something, it comes back, or I fight it. So we need to be able to talk to them about what it actually means, what death means. And
we're going to cover some of that. Deanna and I have outlined for an upcoming topic. Basically, you're going to die, so start talking about it.
Oh, yeah.
We'll talk about things like advanced directives, estate planning, having conversations about the things that we should talk about, even if we are young and healthy. So as we're wrapping up today, Vanessa, do you still believe in love?
I do. And I think I feel so, and I can say this, I feel so lucky that he loved me in the ways that he did, and that I loved him in the ways that he did, because I don't think that I could be looking for love if I didn't feel that way. Do you know what I mean? There's something so big and immense about it, and that he wanted me to live a full and happy life, that I know that I could never deny myself of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I think sometimes, and this is a conversation just, I guess, to kind of ruminate on as we're ending the podcast for people to think of. I've heard before, some people, they're like, if I die, they better not find someone else. And I think I get it.
Yeah.
But, I don't know that anybody's happy being the surviving spouse. I've told my dad, my dad and mom were together over 30 years. We've had some conversations about it. Like if my mom would have told him, don't you dare find anybody else, he might have 20 more years, maybe longer.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's really important, because I'm going to tell you, I think a part of this too is sometimes you don't get to have those conversations. We didn't get to have those conversations, and you have to go with, what you feel about the other person would want for you. And I also think that there has to be a piece of that's part of your grief too, what you need and what your self-care is. And I know we're going to talk about that also.
Tears are coming now? You made it this long? Really?
I'm just like, there's no, like, when you know it, but it's like hard to pull it out.
Right.
And you're like,
do you think, I know the answer to this, but I just want to hear you say it. You think Greg's happy for you right now?
I do, and we'll talk more, and we can, about my life, how much my life has transformed since he died. And I swear to you, it's just, I feel like he has been such a big piece of growth for me. Life has found so much more meaning after his death, which sounds so strange, but you wake up and you go, what am I going to do with this? I wake up every day knowing how precious this is and that I could die tomorrow and that I would be at peace with that if I did. But I've really gone go big or go home, since he died.
What are some of, you're into photography now?
Yeah. So I am a photographer as well. And, that did not start till after Greg died. And the story is, he loved photography. A couple months before he died, he bought his first camera. And every time we were out of treatment, done with chemo for the day, he'd be like, let's go for a road trip in the car. And we would take the camera. We would go to the lake. We would go to the mountain. We would go to the beach. And I have some of the most amazing photographs that this man took. And after he died, and I was struggling to live life again, the first thing that made me feel something was picking up his camera from across the room. And I remember walking to the park that was across the street from my apartment at the time. And it was fall. And I just started photographing. And I remember, I'll never forget, I have this written down somewhere. There was a mom playing on the swing with her child, and her child was laughing. And it was the most innocent, life unscathed. I just was like, it's okay. There's still beauty here. There's still this sacredness. There's this newborn, and right. Ever since that day, I started, looking through life. It was life in a different lens, right? And that was because of him. And so since that has happened, this has become a love for me and a passion for me. And I started actually photographing couples, which sounds strange, but I started photographing couples that were in love. And a big part of that was because now what do I have? Even though I have my memories from him, I have photographs of him. I have photographs of us at our wedding. I have him smiling and him kissing me and us dancing. And I'm like, that's so special to me. And I want to be able to give that back to people, those raw, authentic moments, And so that's a big part of my self-care, not only as a therapist, but also in my grief.
Right. I had a moment similarly in this sense of acceptance and new lens. Growing up, I remember my mom would always take us to the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk. And I've been trying to do this thing, as a single mom, trying to go anywhere with two kids is a pain in the ass, but trying to go to an amusement park thing's a whole new thing. But yeah. I took them on this vacation by myself, which was a big deal. And I know that sounds silly. And I know there's a lot of single parents that do this stuff all the time. But for me, this has been a process. But anyway, a couple of weeks ago, I surprised them, drove to the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk, and I have so many memories there with my mom and my sisters. Mm-hmm. And the difference was this time is that my mom never got on the rides and stuff, but I was on basically every ride with the kids. And I remember at one point just looking over at them and thinking, this is the kind of mom I want to be. And I'm honoring the parts of my mom that I love so much by being here. And this was our place. And I made them ride the carousel with me because that was my mom's thing. And it was just, when you can come out of the other side of grief, you can come out in broken pieces put together in a different way. Mm-hmm. And so I guess to kind of wrap it up.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm going to tell you, I remember writing in my journal not long after he died, and I said, I feel like a war has gone on, and I feel like a bomb has exploded, and there is shrapnel everywhere and pieces of me everywhere. And now I have to go through that rubble and decide what I'm going to keep and what I'm going to let go of.
Right.
And I think that really speaks to, look, and this is part of it too, right? Just in these things that you and I have not talked about together before, but now we're having this conversation live and going, we experience the same things. They might be different, right? But internally it's what we pick up, how we get through that is very similar. And I think there's a lot of beauty to that. And that's why I think, and this is a great, place for us to kind of summarize, is that talking about this, being open about your grief is the best medicine that you can give yourself.
It absolutely is. It's the only thing that works.
It's the only thing.
You shove it down and it's going to find its way out, good, bad, or otherwise. So why not give it the potential to do something that's positive and life-changing? And this is where I tell clients, I'm the most obnoxiously optimistic person.
Yeah.
And it's possible.
And there's something to be said for that, right? When we have gone through this ourselves, and I share as much as, my clients like to ask questions. So I tell them I'll answer as much as I feel I can or comfortable with. I feel like there's a part of that. It's kind of like when people are going through addiction, they want to have a therapist who has gone through this themselves, and I think there's something really important about sharing that piece because people know that you get it.
Right. And people listening that may be in the field or getting educated and going into the field, yes, of course, there are certain boundaries. You should never be sharing information just because you want someone to make you feel better or whatever. There's appropriateness, but the connection period, whether it's therapeutic or with somebody that you just cross paths with or with your own friends and family, the connection is in the humanity and it's in the messy.
Yeah, absolutely. So it doesn't have to be the nitty gritty. Like most of my clients don't know all my details, right? But they know that I've experienced a great loss in my life.
Right. So as we're wrapping up today, I always recommend that we push and challenge ourselves in new ways. It does build resiliency. And there is scientific proof that if you build resiliency, you're better able to cope when you suck at something. And then sometimes you realize you might be good at something. So to try something new is definitely important. I think this counts as ours for the week because this is a messy subject.
I agree. Now we can go eat some ice cream and have a brownie.
I know, right? And before we leave, I do want to ask about your self-care because being a therapist and also just life in general, living down in Southern California and trying to manage all the things that go into life, what does your self-care plan look like? Or what are things that you make important besides photography?
Yeah, I think it's really important too because people ask me like, how do you do this work and go through your own personal grief and and take care of yourself? And I really have to make a point to schedule my self-care just like I schedule anything else, and that sounds silly, but adulting is real, right?
Right.
So I have to make sure, I'm a big runner. And so if I'm not running at least 3 times a week or doing some type of cardio activity, I don't function as well. And I don't sleep as well. So last week I was going for a run and it was the simplest thing, but I was running and the sun was setting and I was running towards the sunset. And and those are the moments too that I think about him, like he's in that sunset. Like he wants me to see it. He wants me to enjoy it, And so for me, just the small things, earthly things, I talk about it, going to the mountains for me, going to the beach for me, I feel very connected there. I also feel very connected to him there. So that's a part of my self-care. So yeah, I would say the cardio, the photography is one of them, and really connecting, I think, with my friends and family. If I'm not connected to my tribe, I'm not as energized and I'm not as positively authentic, I think, with myself. And so that's something that I make sure to do. Call my friends, call my moms. I say moms because I have more than one mom.
I've talked about on the podcast before that I do enjoy doing all the physical activity. Running, I don't know about you. We were all cool until you said you liked running. And
I saw your face because, I can see her while we're doing this.
Yeah. Well, there's the point where me and Vanessa don't get along. But
you've been doing some crazy stuff though. Is that right?
I do. But, I've talked about this on the podcast and as we're wrapping up with the self-care piece, I still, even though I realize I'm healthier than my mom ever was and my kids are this age and I can do these physical things, I had this epiphany in this last week, which has been really interesting because it's like I'm always fighting with my weight. I'm always fighting with food choices, whatever. But I wanted to read this because it got some good response online. And it says, do you ever realize how much your body loves you? It's always trying to keep you alive. That's all your body has to live for. Your body is making sure you breathe while you sleep, stopping cuts from bleeding, fixing broken bones, finding ways to beat the illnesses that might get you. Your body literally loves you so much. It's time to start loving your body back. So I just had this shift. Instead of this deprivation or I have to do it. And trust me, sometimes I hate doing all that. I've had this shift lately where I'm trying to make this more loving approach. And I don't know, something's been different in the last week. So that's been pretty pivotal.
Okay.
So if people want to get in touch with you in terms of maybe telehealth, or they're in the greater Los Angeles area, Vanessa, what's a great way to do that, or the way to do that?
Yeah, so the best way to do that is to contact me through my website, which is mytherapypasadena.com. So just mytherapypasadena.com. And you can see me there. You can, under the Let's Connect tab, you can send me a message there. And yeah, I'm here.
All right. And as we come to a close, we would like you to follow us on Instagram. You can look for Shut Up Skippy. Hilarious Humanitarian is Deanna. Also, our H Humanitarians Podcast. You'll find that on Instagram. HilariousHumanitarian.com and ShutUpSkippy.com for some stuff we have going on. I've got some new blogs that are up there, and I am also looking for guest bloggers, so that's kind of fun. But I wanted to share this listener shout out that came in from Linda. This one came in last week. We had my friend Lou on, who lost over 120 pounds and has changed his life around. And it says, awesome podcast. Thanks, Lou, for sharing such an inspiration. Everyone should have a guy with this great attitude towards life within their life. This listener listens from Ireland, and she's That's extending awesome. the invitation for us to come on over and do some Spartan workouts in Ireland. So big thank you to Linda for that. So thank you so much. What an amazing story you do have, and I certainly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It means so much, and I feel grateful to be able to share with you and with everybody else. So I appreciate it. I feel honored.
Well, thank you very much, and we'll be back next week. Between now and then, please find the Hilarious Humanitarians Podcast on all the major distributors, if you will. We are free, but we do look for your ratings and your subscriptions, and we will see you next week. Bye.